Hey everyone. So today we are talking about the five things or the five categories of things that can kill you. And we have some people coming in for our inner circle campfire membership. So kudos to the people taking that time and that energy, that investment to learn more about the things that can kill you on the outside, in the outdoors, but also in our everyday life. So these are our campfire sessions, our Q&A sessions, and we'll start streaming these in these kind of formats. Without further ado, let's start today with the five things that can kill you. So, if you are coming in from YouTube or Instagram, just put your comments in the kind of comment sections or in the chat sections, and we should be able to see it on the side. What we're going to do is kind of branch out and kind of show you some of the five main categories that some of our students are learning right now. And I want you to think, what are some of the things that you think would really harm you to the point where you don't think an emergency responder could respond in time. And typically, at the very best, metropolitan kind of areas, response times can be from like anywhere from 15 minutes to half an hour. But in some rural sites, it can be beyond 30 minutes. So, what can kill you within 15 minutes, do you think? And we'll start talking about our categories and kind of doing some review of some of the things that we've talked about since starting our emergency medical management. So, when we think about emergency things that can hurt you very quickly, and how we typically evaluate a situation, it always comes down to a very similar type of sequence of evaluation and thought processes. Number one, you would think about, okay, how do I remember all this stuff? Because you're stressed. Things may be happening for the first time. You've never been in a car accident before. You might be in pain. You might be cold. You might be scared. You're shivering. Your mind's kind of like not focused. So the one thing that I want you to remember, especially if you're one of our students, is remember that I taught you marched. So in the TCCC, the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Guidelines, the sequence is March. So MARCH. People taking our courses right now, they're learning an extra ED to that component. But when we think about the categories of things that are really dangerous and how do we evaluate them and keep things straight when we're seeing a person in front of us who may be ill or having a traumatic injury and they are actively passing in front of us unless we intervene, you think about those at least five different categories. So that's M for massive hemorrhage, A for airway. So this is all this stuff up into kind of like the vocal cords. So that would be like your upper airway that you're concerned about. R is for respiration. Same thing for like ABCs. B's would be breathing, but in this kind of setup, we're talking about R for respirations. And then when we're talking about respirations, the next one is C. C is similar to the ABCs, so that's circulation. So circulations, is there adequate blood flow? Namely, are there pulses? So we'll have little tidbits and tricks for you guys as you're kind of coming in here and kind of sampling some of our information. But one thing that we might focus on a little bit today is we are at the A in our classroom right now. So we might talk about a little bit more focus on airway. So after the R, the respiration, the C, the circulation, we're starting with H. So H is hyper or hypothermia. So that's too hot and too cold. Our body lives in a level of balance. And sometimes when it's too hot, too cold, um, too little electrolytes, too much electrolytes, your heart rate's going too fast or too slow, all these things that affect your hemostasis, your balance, typically puts your body in a very vulnerable state. So the last one that we'll be talking about today is hypo and hyperthermia as possibilities. And it really lends into the things we think about in the outdoors as well, because hypothermia, hyperthermia, environmental exposures. Can you build a shelter? Do you know the clothing that you're supposed to be wearing? And are you able to identify things in your environment that might be helpful for you to maintain that cover and that regulation? So, right off the bat, we have some questions over here, or some comments on one of the things that might be easily life-threatening very quickly. And this is so pertinent because I just got this high velocity aggressive tool. So I got this chainsaw from Harbor Freights, and for those of you in Canada, this is like the Costco of power tools slash like home hardware stuff. And I didn't have any experience using a gas chainsaw. I'm very lucky to live right next to an arborist who's been teaching me. But I wanted an electrical system just because I don't have a whole lot of property. And I'm just kind of cutting down the limbs and down trees from the winter storms and hopefully making some firewood for the next season. But the chainsaws are one of the things like in rural Maine that I see very often. A lot of people cutting through their clothing. And I would say clothing because a lot of the time it's that, oh, I'm just going to delimb this. I'm just going to cut this real quick. And it's the same thing for hikers just going on a day hike and ending up being there overnight. When you just add that just statement, it's almost setting the universe up for some kind of injury. We see a lot of people cutting into their legs. That's why chaps exist. But more importantly, I have an electric chainsaw that chaps don't always work. So if you see some YouTube videos of electric saws against chaps, these are multiple layers of kind of fibrous tissue that supposedly jam up your chainsaw and works really well for gas operated and diesel operated chainsaws. But it doesn't work well with electric chainsaws, unfortunately. It gives you some protection and it might seize up a little bit, but it still rotates. So being able to manage a massive bleed is so essential. Like how many of you just put in the comments have a tourniquet? Like just let me know. Put a 1 if you have a tourniquet, put a 2 if you don't have a tourniquet or you don't know how to use one. And the thing that I'm curious about is why is that? Is it because you are unfamiliar with it, uncomfortable with it, you don't think you need it? The thing that I want to emphasize in this first one, because when we think about massive hemorrhage, that's number one. That's the first thing we evaluate because massive hemorrhage from our arms and our legs are one of the most common things that kill you that is preventable. So that's why it's so high on that priority list for a lot of different traumas. And one of the reasons why we're evaluating that really quickly. So tourniquets, super important. Um, 1 second. Okay, so we have some people saying, nope, don't have a tourniquet. But what kind of tourniquets should we get? So tourniquets, by definition, I would kind of define it in the most simplest language, is it's a band type device that can tighten and then has another mechanism. So it needs this secondary mechanism to make that band even tighter and a way to secure that. Because without that mechanism, you don't have a tourniquet, you have some kind of banded. And when you're using just that band, let's say a thick leather belt, it's not going to give you a reliable stoppage of that bleeding. What happens is you get tired, the muscle itself gets smaller from the bleeding and the loss of volume, and it gets loose. There is over a 90% chance of that failing if you're just trying to tighten something with your hand. That's why it's so important, whether you have a tourniquet or thinking about buying a tourniquet, and improvising a tourniquet, that it has that mechanism. So typically we have a windlass, so some kind of stick that's thumb thick, or it can be a bottle that's unbreakable like a metal canteen. Or one thing that I love teaching our students is what's one thing that most people have that's not compressible? Shoes. So whether it's the patient's shoes, your shoes, you should be checking pulses anyway, so you can be taking off the shoe. The rubber in it only compresses to a certain amount of point, and it is better than running away to try to find a windlass because people bleed out in a span of minutes, especially for a major bleed or an amputation. So just popping off the shoe and incorporating that in your tourniquet is super fast, and it's mostly there for the majority of people. If not bystander, hey, I need your shoe right now. Toss it over. Hey friends, I see some familiar faces over there, Amos. Glad to see that you're here and hope to hang out soon. Really do. Thing you Yeah. So we have a comment here from the coffee enthusiast. A tourniquet is something that you want to have but never want to have to use. There's a lot of pain with it, and I think that's why people are wearing of having them. And there's a lot of myths around tourniquet use as well. One being that you're in a situation of life or limb. You have to make that decision whether you put it on, you're gonna cause an amputation, or you save your life. But in all reality, that's not even part of the discussion because a tourniquet, if placed properly and you not doing things that I'm going to talk about in a really quick second, it should not cause an amputation, especially in our everyday living situation where the EMS is going to catch you within 15 to 30 minutes and you'll be seeing myself or another ER doctor within an hour at the most because at that kind of acuity, you're basically reeled right into the ER and we're going to make space for you. So, in that time where it's less than 2 hours, um, likely the case, if you put it on and just that's what you did. You did your job. You stopped the bleed, and you had the 911 call and pick them up. The likelihood of them getting amputations is quite low because you need to have a tourniquet on for a long, long time. We're talking about several hours before we even get into that realm of amputation. Things that might happen though is kind of intermittent chronic pain. So there might be some nerve damage, there might be some tissue damage. So there will be some um, tissue breakdown, some muscle breakdown, but it wouldn't necessarily cause an amputation. So if you're worried about buying a tourniquet or having a tourniquet in your kit, just know that it's not going to cause an amputation. And it certainly will save someone's life if you do need it. And that's one thing to kind of think about. When do I need a tourniquet? What do you guys think? How would you kind of in your mind decide when to put one on? And I will talk about while you guys are thinking on that, kind of another thing that's really important. We talked about okay, you have a tourniquet and it's not typically going to give you an amputation, but what will? What will when you already have a commercial grade tourniquet? And one thing that might increase your chances of getting an emergent surgery, whether it's a fasciotomy where they have to cut into kind of the casings of your muscles and open up multiple compartments in that extremity, or an outright amputation, is if you put on a tourniquet, you stop the bleed, but you don't stop the pulse. So that's another thing that we learned just 2 classes ago, how to check our pulses. So a few tips on that is kind of number one, radial pulse. We'll talk about that because it's the easiest one to talk about right now. So if you have a bleed from your arm or your hands, or your forearms, you really want to be knowing how to take a radial pulse because a tourniquet should be able to stop the bleed and stop the pulse. If you put on the tourniquet, you ratchet it down tight, you do the windlass, and after all that, you check the pulse and you still feel something. What that means is that you have now made your arm a one-way valve balloon. So you are stopping the venous blood flow, but not stopping the arterial blood flow. So blood is going into that arm, but not able to come back to the heart. And as that balloon gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that pushes a lot of pressure on your muscles. And what happens with that is it kills things off faster. It's putting more pressure on that. And we call that compartment syndrome, which becomes a surgical emergency and warrants that fasciotomy. And in the ER, and if you come to like a critical access hospital like mine, we don't do that. We only have the ER doctor and maybe a hospitalist during the day, and maybe a surgeon depending on the day if he's not booked up. So it is very prudent that you don't cause this to your patient because sometimes when you go to your local ER, they might be in a setup where they can't really do that fasciotomy immediately, and that happens when you don't place that tourniquet properly. Another thing that could kill that arm even quicker is that thought that you have to give your arm a little bit of oxygen. So when I say turn, 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 turn until you stop the bleed, People are thinking, oh, but that's zero oxygen. If you hold your breath for a few minutes, you already feel kind of pretty lightheaded. How's that viable if you put a tourniquet on and it's there for multiple minutes, half an hour, an hour? The alternative, a lot of people think that they might loosen the tourniquet, give it a little bit of oxygen, and then close it to stop the bleed and kind of on, off, on, off. And what that does is it causes something, a phenomenon called reperfusion injury. And reperfusion injury is quite scary because it kills cells faster. So your cells, your muscle tissues, and when it ruptures, all that toxins, all the electrolytes that aren't supposed to be in your bloodstream that are typically in your cells get released to your central blood circulation. And as you release it, that all that chemicals and all that electrolytes, all those toxins have an opportunity to go back to your heart. And what happens when it gets to your heart? Those electrolytes, those toxins can cause a fatal arrhythmia. And these are things when you're dealing with your heart that can kill you in seconds and minutes. So you don't want to be doing that. So don't do those on and off things. You put it on and you keep it on. If you're in a context in the wilderness and you're out there or in a military setting or what have you, and rescue is not coming, and you know that your situation is going to be there for more than 2 hours, our students learn how to do that next step. So if you're interested in that type of stuff, definitely give our online lessons a chance. Your first few weeks are completely free. You just need to go to www.survivenow.online/lifeline, and you'll get access to all the lessons that we've done to date, in addition to 3 to 4 live lessons with me. So that's a month work of education. And a lot of people, by the end of that month, are ready to take their wilderness first aid certification, which we grant to our students as well. So if that's interesting to you, check it out. So yes, the coffee enthusiast, absolutely right. The biggest arteries and veins only. Yes. So you want to be blocking both the arteries and the veins for sure, for sure. Now, after bleeds, it's not all the time that you need a tourniquet. So it's also super important that you might want to consider learning how to do proper pressure bandages, which doesn't need a whole lot. Just looking around here, I have this guy from True Clot, but this is just a regular ace bandage with some rolled gauze as a pressure point. So you can use that to have a pressure bandage. And if you want to learn about that, we do have a lesson that's released on pressure bandages. But if you notice that the bleeding is stopped with direct pressure, so you're putting your hand over it with some gauze and some weight, and the bleeding has stopped, then hey, you don't necessarily need a tourniquet because it's stopped. And by definition, it's not necessarily a massive bleed. Now, as we move on, this week we'll be talking about airway stuff because airway stuff is the A. It's the number two in our marched algorithm. And airway, when we think about airway, it's pretty much, for simplicity's sake, vocal cords and up. So things like trauma to the face, things like anaphylaxis, where you have a severe allergic reaction and your throat's kind of swelling, which is super, super scary, and choking. So those are kind of like our main categories that we talk about. And quite simply, if you are just someone, a pedestrian, kind of walking in the everyday life, it's super important to know how to do the Heimlich maneuver to kind of pop out that obstruction. It's important to know how to use an EpiPen, especially if someone might be struggling to do it themselves. So you can get their EpiPen and do it for them. And very important to know how to maximize and then airway. And it's one of the things that we can talk about right now because the other ones are a little more involved. We will be having a lesson on that that's being recorded this weekend, I think Sunday or maybe Monday, and then available for you guys to view if you want to. So, how can we optimize an airway? When we think about the airway, one of the things that maybe the most obscure or most obstructing is a tongue, especially here in North America, where our necks and tongues and just everything over here might be a little thicker. That tongue, typically, if they're lying on their back, let's say unconscious, that tongue typically gets in the way of the airway and kind of blocks that. That's why a lot of people who are typically heavier set have sleep apnea. Just like the tissue on the neck and the tongue kind of pushes down on that airway, and they kind of snore and kind of do these gagging things at night. And one way you can modify that to see if they will breathe on their own is all you're really doing is pushing that jaw forward. And what that does is that jaw and that tongue goes forward and it kind of unobstructs that area. And there's a few ways that you can do it. I'll see if I can bring out a model over here. We got this guy over here who had a bandage. Let's take this off. But he does have a jaw that we can manipulate. So let's see if there's a way to kind of show this. So again, forward for this jaw would be upwards. And what you would want to do is you reach behind the angle of the jaw over here. So you might use your fingers, and then you can either use your thumb on the cheekbone or your palm. I typically like using my palms, or if I can't reach because they have a really long face, I might have to use just my fingers. And what you're doing is you are hooking over here and bringing it upwards. And you're using your thumbs or your palms as a counter force that is pushing down. So your fingers are pushing up and your palms are pushing down, or your fingers are pushing down. So with fingers, it's like that. And you're bringing the jaws forward. And with the palms, same thing, bringing the fingers up. And what that does is it opens up the airway. That's a little tip for you guys. As we're moving down the line, anaphylaxis and knowing how to do the Heimlich maneuver on kids, on infants, on adults, on larger adults, on pregnant ladies. All these things are super, super important, and things that we're going to be reviewing in our next lesson as well. So if you want to jump in on that, again, just click the link in the descriptions or look at my profile and you'll find that. It doesn't, so Coffee Enthusiast says that doesn't look comfortable. Oftentimes, they're breathing in so much difficulty, they're going in and out of consciousness. So what happens when you breathe really quickly or have trouble breathing? There's kind of two big things. One of them, you don't have enough oxygen, so your consciousness it wanes. Number two, if you do have an obstruction and CO2 is building up in your system, you actually get quite loopy and you also go in and out of consciousness. So if either of those situations are present, it will be uncomfortable, but they probably won't really resist you. And this does work in the recovery position. So recovery position is basically a patient or a victim. You're putting them on their side so that if they vomit, they'll vomit out instead of like down into their airway. And in addition to that, their tongue when they're kind of sideways, it typically falls forward. But sometimes if they are quite large or they have an abnormally large tongue, that doesn't work. And that jaw thrust while they're sideways does work. And I know for a fact that works because I do anesthesia for endoscopies. That's little visual camera tubes in your throat and in your bottom, and they are almost always on their side when you're doing this. And the one thing that I do if they start to decrease in their saturations is just a jaw thrust while they have oxygen in their nose, and that works the majority of the time. You don't have to put a breathing tube in there unnecessarily. So awesome. So those are some of the categories of things that can kill you. I would love to know what people are interested in learning, whether it's from a medical standpoint or from a survival standpoint. Again, we are running through these scenarios and these educations every week. If you want to join us, and we are learning some survival skills as well, because I think they lend into each other. When we think about hypothermia, we think about shelter building, we think about fires. When we think about bushcraft and learning cool skills, you're almost always going to cut yourself at some point as you're learning these things. Even if you're super experienced, sometimes accidents happen. So knowing how to manage deep cuts, but also chronic wounds. If you're on something called like alone, how do you make sure that wound doesn't get infected? Those are super, super important things. Do I have a mailing list sign up for your classes? Yes. So, classes are ongoing, Amos. So, when you're ready for the classes, or let's say you just want to hop in, what you can do is hop in, get that free months, and let's say you're on season 12 of Alone and you needed some time to kind of chill out for a little bit, just message me personally. We can pause your membership before you get billed so that you'll have access to like our live Q&A sessions like this. And then when you're ready, you can jump back into the lessons as well. So I want to make these zero barriers for everyone to try to learn more outdoor and medical skills. So definitely, let's see if this works. I'll put on the link to our courses. And if you just sign up there, then you'll be able to get that free month's worth. And if at the end of the 30 days, you're like, I love this stuff, but I just can't commit to learning. All of this is on your own pace as well. I would say the majority of our students look at the replays because I cut them out into like 15, 20-minute chunks. And if that's something that would be more valuable to you, you'll have access to the replays as well in our membership site. Thank you. Thank you guys. So that was our fireside chat for medical and survival stuff. I hope you found some of this valuable. In the coming weeks, it will soon be May, the Stop the Bleed month. So super excited for that. And we will be giving some free education webinar to anyone who's interested. So keep an eye out for that. Share it with your friends, because if you want to learn how to save a life, and this is number one in the algorithm, the first thing that you should probably know how to do, just let them know I'm doing it at the end of May. And we're going to be having some awesome giveaways with tourniquets, bleeding kits, whole $200 backpacks full of medical stuff. So keep your eyes out for that. And as soon as the registration happens, I'm also doing some behind the scenes training as well. So I'm only offering it to 20 people. If you want to snag one of your seats for that, be sure to be the first to sign up. All right. Thanks, guys. Much love. And I will see you at our another campfire Q&A session.